So, thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk through a little bit about the behind the scenes process at Minitex of walking through to a data warehouse. So, with that, I am Sarah Anderson. I've been working with data at Minitex for several years now. Um, Most of my time has been spent with Tableau and data visualization, but with this project, I've had the opportunity to look more into SQL and databases, and so that's been kind of fun for me, and I'm excited to share a little bit about what I've learned with you all. With that, I thought we'd do a quick little background. And the reason we needed to start this project was because of a bigger project trying to identify and share our Minitex value. The goals for that project were to tell the whole big picture story of Minitex. So we have many different services here, and we hadn't had a way to share that big picture organization wide view. We also wanted to give libraries their actual use and engagement with Minitex services. And that's definitely something that we had never been able to do before. So those were the two big goals that kind of prompted this whole project. And right out the gate, one of our biggest challenges was the whole idea of siloed data. So every unit and service collected their data independently. So they collected what they wanted, how they wanted, and saved it wherever they wanted, which created some real issues for us. Some of the problems with siloed data are duplicated efforts, first of all. So in our office, units were creating similar tools to do the exact same work. So we had all kinds of different post-training surveys and all sorts of different things that wasted both time and resources. And because they were separate, people were defining things different, formatting things different. And so if we wanted to compare that survey data, for example, we weren't able to. So that created those fragmented views where we couldn't understand things big picture. And also, that creates gaps in decision making, which obviously, if you're making flawed decisions, that's not a good way to be presenting your data. So our plan for all of this was to create a data warehouse. And so I dug in and started doing research on data warehouses, and I quickly became really overwhelmed because there is a whole slew of terminology and jargon and scary things that that get talked about when you start researching data warehouse. And down at the bottom there, I have all the emojis of all the emotions I ran through. Um, but I quickly learned that it's really not that scary. This idea of extract, transform, load, the ETL process is something that was on that last slide. And this is pretty much the framework that we work through for this process. And so this is what we'll talk through today too. And here's a very simple visualization I made where when you're starting out, you need to identify the data sources that you have. The next step is to extract things from those data sources. Then you are going to transform things, and this is kind of the bulk of the work where most time is probably going to be spent. Once you have your data looking good, you load it into your warehouse, and then you are able to use it for reporting, analyzing, and creating all the things that you need. And you're able to really rely on that warehouse data because you know it's gone through these different processes to get it cleaned up. So step one is that data inventory. Here you want to locate all of your existing data sources and you want to think about what is relevant for your warehouse. At Minitex, we pretty much just said we want everything that can fit there into our data warehouse. So that makes that step kind of easy. I did want to call out to the importance of collaboration at this step because we had that overarching values project. We had built in kind of like stakeholders and people who were there to help us find data, identify what's important, how that data can be displayed in reports, what should be our priorities. So I think throughout this whole process, it's important, but especially in this data collection phase of things. So our output for this was a big inventory spreadsheet. On that spreadsheet, we had where the data was stored, what formats the data was in, how often it was updated, who were the primary contacts and owners of that data, and all that kind of information. Here's just a list of different places where your data might be hiding. Um, we had event registration data. If you have custom apps or tools, you might already have databases that are outside of your warehouse. So look for stuff there. Website analytics, spreadsheets. We have tons and tons and tons of spreadsheets, forms and surveys, and other data source locations listed there. So at this point in this process, a challenge for me was feeling totally overwhelmed. We had this huge spreadsheet of where all of our data lived, and I had no idea how to tackle getting it into the warehouse. So definitely overwhelming. But the best thing to do is just keep moving. And so we moved into the extract process. So this is retrieving raw data from the source systems so it can be centralized for more processing in that transform step. And the goal here is just to capture accurate and complete data. You want to make sure you're not missing things. I thought we would walk through an example, and this is actually the first data that we tackled in getting stuff into the warehouse. This was the data coming from our event registration system. And for us, this was a good place to start because it was one of the only places where all units were collecting things in one place. So we wouldn't have to do any of that piecing together of different formats of data. We knew it was all consistent across the organization. The big negative was that this is a super manual extract process. Um, what we had to do first was configure our web interface to give us all the details we wanted about the events and registrants, like the organizations people were coming from, the event name, date, the presenters, all sorts of different good information like that we got out. And this is one place I want to highlight, as I will, I think, a couple more times. It's super important wherever you can to be documenting your steps. You want to be tracking and saving your settings because we did have to do this export from the vet registration system multiple times, and we want to do it in the future. So it's important to be able to reproduce exactly what you did before. So after we had all those settings configured, we had to export the rosters for each of our event, and that's it for the extract. We had all of our data. Um, Another place you might be getting your data from is spreadsheets. Like I said before, we have tons and tons and tons of spreadsheets at Minitex. This is an example of one of them where I want to point out just a pet peeve about spreadsheets and how spreadsheets are often used as reports. So here, maybe I'll just go back to the spreadsheet so you can kind of see a little bit of what I'm talking about, where you've got these different merged cells. You've got notes over here that you're not even really sure what they're attached to. There's lots of good examples of how we can use, not as a best practice, spreadsheets for both people readable things and machine readable things. And you definitely want to be designing for both of those, but ideally that's not in the same file. So when you're doing those visual tweaks like the merged cells and all that, it's making things look nicer for humans, but making it impossible for machines to read. And those inconsistent layouts and things like notes over on the side also make it hard to analyze. So the better practice is to separate your data storage from your reports and data storytelling. You want your spreadsheets to be clean and really well organized and structured, and you can make your dashboards and reports as pretty and presentable as you would like. So here is just a quick example. And with this, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves into that transform step. But I thought it was good to talk about here where we've moved the spreadsheet into something that is much more clean and easily readable and just translates directly into something like a database. And like I said before, this is where I by far and away spent the most time. Um, some of the things that you'll want to be thinking about in the extract or in the transform process is just cleaning everything up. There's going to be mistakes in your data. There's going to be duplicates and other things. This is a great time to really get rid of all of that. And standardization, we're going to talk through this in much more detail in a little bit, but you want to make sure your data is all following the same format everywhere. If there are things that are missing in your data that you could add to make a more complete story, this is a great time to do that. And like I said before about those integrating things from different units or organization or places in your organization, this is the step where you'll be doing that integration work. So here we are back to our registration example. And in the transform step here, something positive that we had was we know because we tweaked all those settings and saved all those configurations that these CSV files that we have as the output from that first step are all in the same format, which is super helpful. A negative is that we had one individual CSV file for each and every event, and we needed to get them to be just one CSV file. So this is a time when I immediately just went to Google and searched, how do I combine multiple CSV files? Because with all of this work, I think it's important to do that work smarter, not harder is a really good mentality here. So wherever you can leverage tools like Google and ChatGPT, I think there's so much out there that like I don't even know about that is something we can lean on to help us get through some of these difficult tasks. And Google told me that I can use Windows Command Prompt, which is just a built-in Windows tool to combine all of these hundreds of CSV files I had. All I had to do was put them into one folder, point Command Prompt at that folder, run one line, and it just gave me an output of everything in one CSV file, which saved me so much time. Another tool I get really excited about and I use a lot are spreadsheet macros. So here is an example of Excel spreadsheet macros, but Google Sheets always also has Google Apps Script, which you can do essentially the same thing with that as these Excel macros. And for this project, Unfortunately, with all of those CSV files, every single one of the files had a header row in it. And so when everything was merged, there were, hundreds of those same header rows over and over again. And you could have used find and replace for that. But since I was using macros for something else, I just wrote all that into the macro. And so now every time we need to rerun that process, I can just run this macro and everything is taken care of. So I said I wrote everything into the macro, but that's not exactly accurate because these macros, both in Excel and Google, you're able to record your actions. So it's just going to follow along with what you're doing. And then you can rerun what you've recorded. So you kind of have to think a little bit and make sure you're not doing extra stuff while you're recording, but they're super slick and really helpful. Once you have your recordings, you can also go in there and modify the code so you can get exactly what you want. And I haven't tried it, but I would guess that this would be a place where you could really leverage ChatGPT also to get it to help you with this. So that would be something cool to try. The last of my tools in this little list here is spreadsheet functions. Again, there's something exactly like this in Google Sheets as well, but you can see from the data we got from the CSV file, we've got this date range column where ideally for what you're going to be putting into your warehouse, you don't want this whole mass of information to be in your column. You want it to be just like one piece of information. Like here we've got Tuesday, the actual date, the time. So this is all the start information for the event and then the end information for the event. So I know with my whatever reporting tool I'm going to use at the end, it's going to be smart enough to know that this date was a Tuesday. So I don't even care that it's a Tuesday. And I want to split off the date from the start time and then the end date from the end time. So you get 4 columns out of that. And this text to columns function works perfectly for splitting those kind of things off. So again, use Google to search for these kind of things. And there's lots of stuff out there that can really be helpful. So we will start talking through the idea of standardized data that we've hinted at before. And what that is you want everyone in your organization to be following the same formats for things. Like this is a good time to have a conversation and decide on what kind of date formats you're going to use for your data, or whether you are going to use the state code instead of the full typed out state. So just little things like that and coming together on a decision about it is going to be super helpful for your data. Some of the benefits of using standardized data are that your data is going to be more clean. You're going to have less errors and inconsistencies with things. Once you're trying to put everything together, it's going to be compatible. You're not going to have to do all of this process to try to get everything to work together. You just know things are going to work. And then your analysts aren't going to have to do any work to reformat, clean things up because everything is where it should be from the get-go. This leads us to a challenge from our registration data. So when you signed up for this webinar, you filled out your organization for us in a field that is open-ended text. And that is not ideal for Minitex staff. We put in Minitex any number of ways. Here's some examples here. And thinking back to the goals of our value project, where we are trying to tie libraries to their specific uses of our services, it is impossible if we have, 8, 10 different ways that we are calling our organization. So to work through this, I think the very first thing I did do was just try Excel find and replace, but I was working with thousands of different rows of organizations, and it was not possible. And I figured that out very quickly, luckily. And I remembered this tool, Open Refine, that I had not used before, but I knew that my colleagues had. And what Open Refine is a free tool that helps you clean, organize, and standardize messy data quickly and easily. And that's totally true. This tool is great. The feature I use the most is this faceting and clustering feature. So what I was able to do with that in the organizations is I was able to have it look at the organizations and it would say these 8 organizations look like they might be Minitex because they're all somewhat similar. Are they all Minitex? And what would you want to call them? So that was really helpful. And another feature that OpenRefine has that is great in that whole reproducibility thing where you're doing these same steps over and over again. You don't want to recreate the wheel every time, is that it tracks you. So everything that you're doing, it's following along. And I didn't know that the first time I did this. But the second time I saved everything off and used it for the third time and it worked great. So what you're able to do is at the end of working through your project, you're able to export everything, and then when you're restarting up a project, you're able to copy all of that, all those steps back in and run them. And because you've done that, you know that all of your organizations are going to be the same. In my example, all the organizations were going to be the same at the end. Um, so I definitely recommend using it. Here's what it looks like. Um, I don't actually know what any of these things do other than if you tinker with them, they help a lot. You can choose different ways that it's looking at your data. And I just go through and I kind of run through all of them because it finds different things with the different selections. But you can see here that it knows that these 3 University of Illinois, but then it also lumps in Louisiana and Lincoln. But if you shorten these, usually it does a really good job where you can get it to a place where they're all University of Illinois. Then you can say this checkbox to merge them. And then here you're able to put in what you actually want all of those to be called. So I found this super handy. Next up, we are going to talk through planning for the database. So this is also in that transform step. One of the ideas is normalization. And what that is organizing your data into separate tables so it isn't repeated and stays accurate. So one of the benefits of this is reducing redundancies. It saves a lot of storage space, and we'll see an example on the next slide. It also simplifies data maintenance. So if you need to change something in your data, you know you just have to change it in one place. The example here is if you're updating an email for someone, you know, just one place, that's it, which ties into the next idea of data integrity, where you're not getting conflicting records. So in that email example, lots of times in our data, at Minitex anyways, we've got multiple email addresses or phone numbers for the same person because it got updated in one place but didn't get updated in another place. And this idea of normalization gets at all of that. Here is an example, and I know that this is a lot of data and really ugly and not readable. The only idea I had with this is to show that CSV file that we got from our registration data. And you can see over on this side, we have all the things about the event repeated over and over and over again. I think wherever you see that in your tables, it's a good indicator that something should be split off into its own table. So you're saving space and making things much more clean. So instead of that past slide, we did split all that off. So we have one table now for each event, and that ties back to a registration table, storing information about people who are registering, their organizations, and the registration itself. And what that looks like is this. Um, so at the top here is our event table. And this is our registration table. I blacked out all the stuff about people's contact information, but you can see where we've got this event ID column here and an event ID column here. And so that's how everything is tied together, is just by that column. So we're able to squish these tables back together however we need to, just with that little connection, which is really helpful. The better practice for how we could have configured this differently would have been to have three different tables, one for the registrant, the person, one for the event, and then one for the registration itself. But because we're just getting started with this and what we think is the most important piece for us in this project is the organizations, we just left it as is, but there was a better way to do it. So we are still in that transform step. And now we're talking about this idea of a schema. What that is the formal structure of a database. And we'll just walk through a little bit of getting this started. So first up, you want to identify what tables you need. Normalization, we talked through that a little bit. That's an important step in the schema. And then the new thing here is listing the column names for your tables. What do you need to describe and use what data needs to be in each of those? And you want your column names to be descriptive and consistent. Also, when thinking about your schema, you want to be choosing your data types. And this is a place that really tripped me up. So we'll talk through some examples and where I messed up in a little bit. Um, Also, think about your constraints, where you need required fields and where you need unique values. Also, there might be some places where it's important for you to know when this data has been updated or changed. You can think through that. Also, you want to be mindful of primary keys. So when we talked about that link between our events table and our registration table, that number there was a primary key and a foreign key in the other table. So those are super important for linking your tables. And here is a visual example, maybe, of that. So it would be using those three tables. That would be the ideal way to set this up, where we have a table for our registrants, we have a table for our events, and then we have a third table for our registrations. And I've highlighted the primary keys. So you've got a primary key in the registrants and one in the events. The registrations table also has its own primary key, but here's where we have these foreign keys. So this key in the registration table is a foreign key and the same as the events key. So that's kind of how everything gets tied together when we're talking about those keys. Also here we have my second of two pet peeves. And this one is all about me. This is a pet peeve that I do. So I seem to have just go at my whim. I name things different on different days of the week or something. And also, when I did get started with this, I didn't understand that things couldn't, they could have um, the same column name. I thought it would be better if they had different column names so you knew where it was coming from, but that's not really how it works. If you have the same data, you want it to have the same name. You also want to be specific about the names, where if you have something like in this example, it just says status, that's not really helpful. You don't know what kind of status it is. Is it an event status, a registration status? And then the inconsistent formatting, definitely this is a problem for me. Where you just want to be using the same thing all the time. Now I know, now I'm better. But another thing that we do have with our data, and I think it is because we don't actually know what is in that column. We have things that are not descriptive, like this, like value one. So if you have things like that, it's best to be descriptive. And it's also great to get documentation around those different naming conventions. So yes, you want a naming convention guide. And you want to be thinking about this for your tables, columns, and keys, just for everything. And you want to be using a consistent schema. And then I like the idea of having something like a data dictionary or a document so that everyone looking in knows what those definitions are and should be. We can pop over to the load step. So this is where we are putting our transformed data into the warehouse. So this is a big step. We're making it accessible for anyone who wants to use it. The goals here are to ensure that our data is stored clean and reliably. Um, we want to preserve those relationships that we talked about in the last transform step. And we want to make sure people have timely access to it for reporting tools. So here's where we're going to talk through a lot of missteps on my part. Um, in our registration data example, we had thousands of rows of data in Excel that I was trying to copy into our SQL database, and it broke a lot. One of the reasons that it broke was mismatches in data type. So I'm positive that what I did when I was defining data types for my columns was I did a Google search and I asked what types I should be using. I'm not blaming Google, but I'm just saying. Um, so for phone number, I landed on using an integer. But of course, when people have extensions in their phone numbers, they type in EXT. And when they don't have phone numbers, they type in NA. And my personal favorite was, why do you even need a phone number? And I totally agree. Why do we need a phone number? But those all broke when I was copying the data over. And so it was a long string of hitting enter on every single one of those rows that had things that that wouldn't import. So the lesson there is to use text for every single one of those free form fields, even things that are obviously numbers to you. People could put anything in there. So another problem we had with our registration data is that in our sign up, we don't really have any way for international users to be putting in things like their country. So they put a lot of stuff in the state field that we didn't expect. and I had character limits on that state field. So again, things broke here because I wasn't very flexible with how I created those column parameters. Similarly, the zip codes were a place that was a challenge. Um, some countries have zip codes that start with zeros. And so when that switched to the numeric thing, all the zeros were taken off. And also, Canada and other countries use letters in their zip codes. And I didn't know that. Um, but that broke everything too. So it's another place to use text instead of integers or numbers. Another thing I ran into, there were really a lot, um, was these carriage returns or those enters in Excel. So what ended up happening when I copied that in to the database was that it would shift everything over a row or a column. So all the data was now in the wrong rows, and I just had to delete everything and recreate. So I think those carriage returns are kind of sneaky because you can't unsee them in the spreadsheet, but just be aware that they might be there to mess you up. Another challenge, just overall in this whole process, was not knowing what we needed. This was all so new to us that um, a lot of stuff was just learning. And um, I always liked those I wish I knew earlier slides. And I would have had a hard time trying to put them in here because I did think about it, but so much of everything would have been on I wish I knew earlier slides. So one of the things I thought to call out was at first I didn't understand the value of those primary keys. So I did make tables without them. And I think we do still have tables without them that we're going to have to go back and we'll talk through some of the next steps that we are going to focus on with all this. So primary keys are important. We did have to add a lot of columns to things after tables were made. We would either realize that more information was needed, or we would need to be adding in columns to tables to connect them to new data sets that we were adding in. So it's a lot of additions and tweaking with those tables. And also, we made a lot of stuff that we didn't end up using just because we would try things and it wouldn't work or we'd find some better way. So we have a lot of tables still in the warehouse that we need to work through because we don't probably need them. But just thinking through all of those changes that need to be made, here's another place where that idea of reproducibility is really important. So I was advised when starting off to use scripts to create tables instead of just manually making them in the database interface, which is what I was used to and comfortable with, was just making them in the database. But I'm really happy that we didn't do that. And here's kind of an example of that script to just create a table. It's super easy. I don't know why I was so scared of it. But some of the benefits of doing it the scripted way are that you can control your versions and know why you made updates to things. You could do that in Git. Um, like I said, so much we had to delete tables and remake them. I would mess up a whole data set, need to delete the table and remake it. So this made that work much easier. Also, you could send the script to somebody and have them create the same schema if they needed it. And it really supports this sort of ETL type of workflow. So it is a good idea. Some key takeaways from this project. I'm sure you all know that data is really messy and it doesn't always do what you think it will. So you just want to be flexible. And definitely, I would not recommend doing the whole copy paste of thousands and thousands and thousands of Excel rows in. You want to do more testing first. And again, that whole idea of designing for reproducibility, and just again, that consistency. You want to be naming things the same. You want to have standardized formats that everyone has agreed upon. Some of the outcomes of our work to put our data into the database are improved data accessibility and reporting. Now it's it's awesome. Where just yesterday I was asked to spin up a little report on one of our data sets, and now we just get in there, we know our data is clean, we know what everything means, and it's just so much more reliable. We know, yes, that um, we've eliminated a lot of manual steps in collecting this data. And with that, we know that there's much less errors in our data. We've got ways to control for all of that. Um, Faster data decision, data-driven decision making. So again, like I said before, we have improved how good we feel about our data. And this is all just something that we're building on. We do have plans to work through, add more data sets, make this bigger and better. And we'll talk through a little bit of that in a minute. But here, just as an outcome, I did just want to show a really messy data warehouse where we do have a lot of things that we need to clean up, but it's fun to see a successful, although it doesn't feel very impressive just looking looking at it like that. So on our roadmap for things that we still want to do, again, that cleanup, we need to delete off those tables that we made and we didn't use, or I have test tables in there. There's just a lot of cleanup. Again, we need to look back at those column names and make sure that everything matches up, make sure everything has a primary key. Um, Lots of stuff we learned to go back to the originals to fix. We are going to enhance our registration system. So instead of that open-ended text for organizations, we are at some point going to have a drop down or a select there for people so that we know without going through a whole big process what organization people are coming through. In all of this, we have not had a place to put qualitative data so far, and we know that that's a big part of the picture of our value. So that is something we are looking into getting into the warehouse. And I did talk a lot about documenting and tracking things and but that is something we do not actually have yet. So that is on our future roadmap. Some things we do have documented, just not the whole Git side of things. The main lesson I learned is just that this is lots of redoing and trial and error, and you definitely don't have to do everything right on your first try. This is just such a learning process, and it's been a lot of fun though.
So I might start a question. Um, so recapping a little bit, you had data in all kinds of different places, and you brought it into this SQL database. And then if somebody wants a report, do you pull it into Tableau, or what do you do? What is that part? Can you talk about that part a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. Like I said, I am just a mostly Tableau person, and I'm just comfortable with working with Tableau where it just is people ask for something, I just can create that connection into the database. I link up all the tables that I know are needed in Tableau, and then can just create some super fast, here's a really ugly looking thing. Does this work for you? Does this answer your question kind of thing? But I know there's all kinds of other products and tools that we could use, or even just copy things into Excel for people, or but yeah, Tableau is my big workhorse. So that's what I'm most comfortable with. But yeah.
I was glad when you mentioned Open Refine. I love Open Refine.
How do you use it?
It just helps so much with that messy data. I do the same thing. I do the facet so I can see like what, how many things do I have for this and how can I
Yeah.
clean this up? And of course, like splitting columns and all of that sometimes too. The
Yeah.
clusters, like you talked about. Yep,
Yeah.
all good.
Do you know more about all that functionality on the sides and top, or do you do what I do and just play around with it until you get something that looks good?
Yeah, I can't say I'm an expert, but I had one example. I can't remember what it was, but it was very complicated. There were so many clusters to work through to finally get like to the end where but it was better. I mean, it was still messy, but it was a lot better. But it's just true that real world data is so messy, especially when people are just entering things free form. There's so much variety.
Exactly. Okay, and I see we got a question from Shannon. I'm wondering how many folks are able to access your warehouse in your organization. Great question. And that is, I think, something that I did have this other slide about things to talk about, which was like data governance. But this was just a tacked on the end thing. And I don't have a super good answer for that right now, because right now our warehouse is only accessible by us in the IT department. And that's not ideal. But I think it's just so new for us that we don't have ways built out for other people to organize it. So it feels a little bit like I'm the gatekeeper right now of everything in the warehouse, but that is definitely not ideal. And so that's something more that we at Minitex also need to consider.
I thought I'd mention one thing while we wait to see if anybody has any more questions.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the data dictionary part, there was a course that NC Live did a little bit ago where she went through all this detail of this very complicated data analysis. And at the beginning, she's saying to do these really tricky things, not tricky, but really detailed things, like with keeping track of data dictionary and all this thing. And you don't know at first, but once you get a little further, you're like, oh, I see the wisdom in this now. I just like, I understand. That was so brilliant.
I know with all that kind of stuff, I have such a hard time documenting things as I'm going, because it feels like such a pain where you're like, I just want to get through this pile of work. I don't want to sit and talk about why I'm making the choices I'm making and doing the things. But yes, whenever I do it and then I look back and I need to reference it, I'm like, oh, so glad I did that. And but yeah, that's also something that's like not super built into the workflow now. It's like so much of an afterthought where it's like, oh, yep, we should think through documenting and oh, I
I
know.
don't know that it's anybody's favorite thing. And I try to like log when I'm doing things, and still I'll go back and I'll be like, I can't read this. I don't remember what I did. This doesn't make any sense. Mhm.
Oh, no, I know. It's a definite, like you said, there's like such wisdom in doing it, but not easy.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, well, thanks.
It sounds like a pretty painful project. Like it's a really big, tricky, hard, difficult project.
Yeah, it feels like taming a tiger or something like that, where it's like there's just no good way to do this except for just get started. But it's been fun. Like I've learned so much. So the good stuff. How long has this process been? I was just looking back at meeting notes from that values project, and the values project started over a year ago. So that's when all of this got started, it's just been, I would say, little steps along the way of collecting and like adding on data sets and different pieces and working through things. And so it's been a long way, but a lot of that has been to working through the different visualizations. Because the point where we are in that value project now is we've just sent out our reports, which are these Tableau reports for the libraries, to our, I think we've got 6 pilot libraries. So we sent them out, and at 2 o'clock, we have our first meeting with one of those pilot libraries to talk through the visualization, to see how they're working for them. So after that, then we're going to go back and try to do the reiterations of, I don't know if it's like Data Warehouse 2.0 or what it is, but yeah, so this is just a long time in the works and ongoing for the foreseeable future as well. Thank you for the questions. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Thanks, Joe.